Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to get into something that's often hidden in plain sight: economic violence. We're going to do that by looking at one person's documented story and the laws that are supposed to be there to protect them.
So let's just dive right in with this quote from a recorded conversation. This is the exact moment a relationship's end turns into a fight for survival, and one person gets casually dismissed as just collateral damage.
You know, so many of these stories begin at the end of something else. In this case, the end of a long-term relationship. But almost immediately, two very different paths are laid out: a promise for a new beginning or a threat. And that choice, well, it's going to define everything.
So on the one hand, you've got this really generous offer in writing, a kind of financial soft landing. But then, boom, just 6 days later, that promise is completely shattered by a verbal threat. All of a sudden, it's not about helping anymore. It's about control, and the fear of being homeless, that's the weapon.
So you'd think that would be the low point, right? But no, that initial whiplash wasn't the end of it. It was just the beginning of a years-long battle with escalating pressure, and it's all captured in emails, text messages, and even recordings. When you lay it all out on a timeline like this, the pattern becomes crystal clear, doesn't it? Offers are made, then they're changed, then they're just pulled back completely. And always with the threat of eviction just hanging there. It's this cruel cycle of hope followed by despair. And this was said during that first attempt to talk face to face. What should have been a negotiation about a fair settlement, well, it turned into a hostile ultimatum. Deadlines weren't being discussed, they were being dictated.
This slide just perfectly illustrates how the finances were weaponized over time. I mean, just look at the numbers. It goes from a proposal valuing her share at over 100,000 euros, and it gets whittled down over 5 years to just 3,000. And the conditions, they get it harsher and harsher, going from a flexible buyout option to a flat-out 2-week eviction notice.
And this quote, wow. This is from a recorded call, and it just lays the entire power dynamic bare. The very money that created this dependence in the first place is now being used as a tool for humiliation and control. The message is simple: you should be grateful, or you are going to pay the price. Okay, so we've seen the behavior, right? The threats, the control, the financial games. But what does the law have to say about all this? Because it turns out this isn't just some messy breakup. It actually has a specific legal name. So what is this called? I mean, giving something a name is the first step to actually fighting it, right? And yet the legal system has a specific term for exactly this. There it is, economic violence. And you know, Spanish law was actually way ahead of the curve here. It was groundbreaking in formally defining this as a specific kind of gender-based violence, recognizing that controlling someone's money can be just as damaging as physical harm. So the law breaks it down into a few different forms. And when you look at this list, a few of these are going to sound very, very familiar, especially that one about hindering access to or disposal of shared resources. That's a direct hit on what happened with a shared home in our case study. And if you're thinking this is just a one-off, tragic story, think again. A 2019 macro survey in Spain found that 11.5% of women over the age of 16 have experienced this exact kind of violence. That is a huge, huge number. Okay, so we have a law, that's great. But that brings up the big question, doesn't it? What's the gap between having a law on the books and actually getting justice? How does a victim fight back when the abuse is all tangled up in the legal chaos of a breakup? This type of abuse is so insidious because it's designed to be a trap. By controlling the finances, an abuser makes it incredibly difficult for the victim to leave, to fight back, or to ever rebuild their life on their own. It's a systematic dismantling of their independence. So to try and tackle this exact problem, a part of the Spanish judiciary took a really proactive and, frankly, a pretty groundbreaking step. They decided to try and close that gap between the law as it's written and the reality that victims are living. And this was a huge deal. Think about it. A judge didn't just rule on a single case. She used her position to formally go to the government and say, hey, this law, it isn't strong enough. We need to do more. She identified the problem and pushed for a real solution to criminalize economic violence more explicitly. And you can see her motivation right here, in her own words. The goal was to shine a light on the part of the abuse that victims feel most sharply, that financial strain, the loss of security, but that the legal system had often struggled to even see, let alone address. But
Here's the thing. Even with all this progress, a massive vulnerability still exists. And our case study tragically highlights a gap where property law can be used to completely undermine the laws against abuse.
And this table shows you exactly where that legal gap is. If you're married, the law has a pretty clear framework for dividing everything up. But if you're unmarried, well, if your name isn't on that property deed, property law can actually be turned into a weapon against you. A process called precarious eviction can be used to throw you out, leaving you with nothing, no matter how many years you invested in that home. Which leaves us with this final critical question. In that messy overlap between a relationship ending and property law, is there a loophole where this kind of abuse can just thrive? A place where one partner is left with everything and the other is left with nothing but broken promises? That is the question we're left with.